Merci.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasurable duty and signal honor to present the pre-recorded statement of His Excellency Alassane Ouattara, President of the Republic of Côte d'Ivoire. Thank you. Your Excellency, Mr. Volkan Bozkır, President of the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly, Your Excellencies, Heads of State and Government, Your Excellency, Mr. Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates. Mr. President, I wish to begin by congratulating you on your brilliant election as President of the 75th session of the United Nations General Assembly and pay a heartfelt tribute to your predecessor, Professor Tijani Muhammad Bande of Nigeria, who was able to adapt the operations of the General Assembly to the constraints imposed by the coronavirus 2019 COVID-19 disease. My tribute also extends to the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres, for his tireless advocacy for stronger support for developing countries to help them cope with this unprecedented health crisis. The unprecedented format of the 75th session of our General Assembly compels us to contemplate the gravity of the situation that the world is experiencing and contemplate the need to do our utmost to ensure that our organization can continue to discharge its mission in the service of humanity. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, for several months now, COVID-19 has upended life in our countries and plunged the world into a socio-economic crisis on a major scale, the most serious since the beginning of the 21st century. And despite significant progress made in the fields of health and scientific research, we seem powerless to halt the spread of the virus or to mitigate its impact. The number of deaths caused by the pandemic is steadily rising. The global economy is almost at a standstill, and countries are now hunkered down behind their borders. People's daily lives are completely disrupted, with tragic consequences for the most vulnerable among us. Given these conditions, the pandemic could wipe out more than a decade's worth of economic growth and social progress made by the African continent, which we all agree is showing extraordinary resilience. This positive development is due in particular to government's preemptive capacity and to the adoption of bold response plans, notwithstanding limited resources. To tackle this pandemic, my country, Côte d'Ivoire, adopted a health response plan amounting to approximately $171 million and an economic, social, and humanitarian support plan providing $3 billion to support the private sector and low-income households. Altogether, this massive, unprecedented effort, which accounts for 5% of my country's GDP, enabled us to obtain impressive results in our fight against COVID-19. These results can also be puts us among the best on the African continent, thanks in particular to a competent and devoted medical corps. And here, I wish to express my appreciation for the international solidarity extended to Cote d'Ivoire for us to implement these programs. And I would also like to thank all friendly countries and our development partners who helped by providing support and assistance through various financial, technical, and material contributions. These excellent results are also the fruit of major reforms and investments in the health sector. In fact, over the period 2018 to 2020, we invested approximately 1.5 billion US dollars in our health sector to help implementation of universal health coverage. And it is our intention to continue this positive approach in dealing with health governance over the period 2021 to 2025 with an investment of approximately 3 billion US dollars. Nevertheless, given this common enemy, COVID-19, the world has shown a disunited front, which is prolonging and delaying the emergence of a collective and effective solution. In the panic caused by COVID-19, we neglected the frameworks and the instruments that would have enabled us to show more solidarity, to mobilize the resources necessary for financing national health, economic, and humanitarian response plans. Regarding Africa, and more particularly my country, the multifaceted contributions made by some of our major development partners is significant, but it is proving insufficient and a far cry from the sums disbursed individually by the major economies or disbursed collectively by certain regional communities for their members. Excellencies, Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, faced with the spread of COVID-19, developing countries, and especially African countries, are more severely affected economically and socially by the absence of initiatives on a global scale to benefit their economies. And in this connection, in my capacity of champion of the African Union's 2063 agenda, I am very pleased at the G20 initiative to grant a moratorium on bilateral public debt servicing for several African countries. I call on all Africa's partners to take bolder measures to relieve our economies, which have been severely affected by the effects of COVID-19. The financial needs of Africa have been assessed at 100 billion US annually over a 3-year period, or a total of 300 billion US dollars. Our countries should also be given the fiscal space to enable them to continue the social investments necessary to address their security needs, especially in those countries that have to deal with terrorism. And the world must finally hear the cry of Africans for cancellation of their country's public debt. My country supports the steps taken by the African Union geared towards collectively renegotiating the debt of the continent with our creditors and to secure an extension of the debt moratorium, which I spoke about earlier. But we need to go even further and to act without further delay. African countries need sustainable solutions, especially liquidities and investments, to resist the unprecedented shock experienced by our populations and to continue our development on the continent. And among these solutions, I would recommend special drawing rights of the International Monetary Fund, which is a mechanism that has already proved to be effective when we had the global financial crisis in 2008 to 2009. The fight against COVID-19 should not lead us to forget other diseases such as malaria and AIDS, which are causing even more victims in African countries. Nor should it lead us to reduce to nothing our efforts to tackle poverty. And here my country has embarked upon bold reforms which enabled us to reduce poverty by 15.6 percentage points in 8 years. The regional study on poverty of the West African Economic and Monetary Union and the World Bank confirmed that Côte d'Ivoire's poverty index dropped from 55.01% in 2011 to 39.4% in 2018. This translates to approximately 1.6 million Ivorian men and women who have emerged from poverty during this period. Again, according to recent World Bank statistics, per capita GDP in Côte d'Ivoire more than doubled, increasing from $1,120 in 2011 to $2,290 in 2019, making Côte d'Ivoire the country with the highest per capita income in the West African sub-region. Côte d'Ivoire owes these successes to a dynamic economy based on strict governance, which enabled us over the last 9 years to achieve an average growth rate of 8% per annum. The economy's growth rate is estimated at approximately 1.8% in 2020 and will be approximately 7.9% in 2021. Despite this particularly difficult situation caused by COVID-19, we are continuing to implement social impact programs, such as the government's social program, which will enable us to further reduce the poverty rate. This is how, thanks to programs to supply electricity and safe drinking water, as well as to improve education and health, we enabled millions of Ivorians to receive electricity and drinking water and have access to schools and health centers in close proximity to their residences. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the COVID-19 pandemic comes as a reminder of how much the world needs the United Nations to act together in our common interest. We must place our common organization at the center of our collective response to this pandemic. Therefore, on the health front, we must guarantee access for everyone to a vaccination as soon as it becomes available. On the economic front, financial assistance for developing countries should be increased and better coordinated. COVID-19 is showing us those threats that our world is called to face in coming years, and which should prompt us to strengthen the options available to the United Nations to take action and its partnership with regional organizations. No one country can take on these new challenges alone because they're global in nature and their consequences are harmful for whole swathes of populations and economies. Alas, we now see that the effectiveness of the United Nations and the mechanisms of multilateral cooperation, where we come up with consensus-based solutions to global challenges, are continually and severely tested because of unilateral initiatives driven by strategic rivalries and competing leaderships. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations Organization is this year celebrating its 75th anniversary. I remain convinced that we must support and breathe new life into multilateralism, which is the only way to deliver lasting international peace and stability. The challenges linked to climate change, to poverty, to terrorism, and the persistent nuclear threat and armed conflicts inter alia give further credence to a new multilateral ambition to which my country subscribes. Such was the spirit behind our accession to the Paris Climate Change Agreement and behind our initiatives taken in the Security Council while we had our mandate there, which came to an end in 2019. It is also the motivation for our participation in peacekeeping operations of the United Nations and for our commitment to finding peaceful solutions to disputes in our region. So as to afford the United Nations more legitimacy and credibility, it is urgent that we, in short order, undertake the reform of the Security Council. It is necessary to forge the broadest consensus around the question of the full and effective entry of Africa into the Security Council of the United Nations on a permanent basis. It is time for Africa to finally play its full role here in this important body. Mr. President, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the people of Cote d'Ivoire on the 31st of October 2020 will elect their next President of the Republic. Despite the health crisis caused by COVID-19, all measures have been taken to ensure that this election will be peaceful and transparent as it was in 2015. I am pleased to see the effective participation of all stakeholders in this process, and I wish to express my deep gratitude to all our partners, especially the United Nations, the Economic Community of West African States, ECOWAS, and the African Union, who have been committed to ensuring Cote d'Ivoire has successful elections. This election is taking place in a democratic environment strengthened by major socio-political reforms and by undeniable economic and human progress, which make my country a prosperous nation and one of the top performing economies of the world. Mr. President, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, in closing, I wish to reiterate Côte d'Ivoire's full support for the United Nations, which must remain the primary forum for generating lasting responses to the major challenges of our time. I wish the United Nations every success and a happy 75th anniversary. Thank you.